Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, February 26, 2020. Last night in Charleston, South Carolina, the last debate before the crucial South Carolina primary this weekend, and then Super Tuesday, which is less than a week away. And it was an ugly debate from the get-go. My favorite candidate, Bernie Sanders, came out bloodied, but no fatal blows were landed. And I was disappointed in Bernie's performance in many respects, and I'll share that with you in a moment. But it was clear that all 6 of the other candidates were gunning for Sanders. He is the front runner, and that is to be expected. But the nature of their attacks and the sophomoric way that CBS anchors Norah O'Donnell and Gayle King moderated the debate set the scene for another nasty food fight. And this one was arguably worse than the one that NBC did last week in Las Vegas. They bait the candidates, chum the waters, and then sit back and watch them scream and scratch and fight each other. And as New York Times TV critic James Poniewozik writes, a debate does not lose control of itself. It's a team effort. And the dubious most valuable players of this one were the CBS moderators Norah O'Donnell and Gayle King, who got flat-out mugged. Well, they got mugged because they did not attempt to moderate the debate. It was simply a series of serial attacks and rejoinders. And occasionally, the moderators would try to change the subject and talk to somebody who had raised his or her hand. But as somebody who's actually moderated these debates at the level of U.S. Senate candidates, I can tell you that there is a balance. You have to maintain a firm hand, and you also have to let people talk when they're saying something that's important. And Poniewozik says there's a special art to moderating. You can ruin a debate by over-policing it, and sometimes it's best to let the arguments flow. And so this is a low point. In American televised debates. And I'll just take a second here to tell you that CBS and NBC, when they run these debates on their main networks, are subject to Federal Communications Commission rules. But there's nobody home at the FCC to enforce them. And so quaint things like equal time, like fundamental fairness, they're all tossed out the door because the cable channels have set the tone more like SportsCenter or even World Wrestling Entertainment. And people of every stripe came away cringing from the debate. So it all opened up because Sanders was the front runner. He was asked if low unemployment indicates that his, attacks on the wealthy are somehow out of place. And Bernie, in his very first sentence, attacked Bloomberg, saying, yeah, the economy is working for billionaires like the former mayor of New York. And that went neener as Bloomberg was given the floor after that. And he interjected his comment about how Sanders is being helped by Russia. And while Sanders did say, Mr. Bloomberg tried to shame him from this demagogic smear, Bernie never clearly pointed out that it was red baiting, that was a McCarthy tactic. Instead, he took the opportunity to address Vladimir Putin and say, if I'm president, there won't be any interference in American elections. And right down to the end, the moderators showed that they were not in control, because after the final touchy-feely question to the candidates, Norah O'Donnell said, well, that's it, it's all over. And Gayle King had to say, oh, no, there's more to come. But it was a commercial break. There was no more content to the debate. But it shows that They really were not in control and on point the entire evening. And Guardian opinion writer Moira Donegan gets it right. The moderators didn't help. Some of the questions were phrased in what seemed like deliberate bad faith, such as when they suggested absurdly that Sanders is sympathetic to authoritarianism. Other questions were pointless softballs that elicited no meaningful information from the candidates, such as a concluding prompt directed at all the candidates, asking them to state their personal motto and correct one misconception about themselves. Now, Elizabeth Warren was again very aggressive, and she aimed her fire primarily at Mayor Bloomberg, but also she tried to kind of take the wind out of Bernie's sails by saying how she and he agree on so much, but she said, "I think I would be a better president." Now, that is a fair comment to make, and she is entitled to make that case. She also, as I say, went after Bloomberg in a really aggressive way, and in a pointed exchange, she accused him of telling a former employee who announced she was pregnant that she should kill it. Now, that's a devastating comment. Bloomberg denies he ever said it. But there is substantial testimony, and when we get to the fact checkers, we'll look at that again in a minute. Sanders certainly expected to be attacked. At one point, he said, "I'm hearing my name mentioned a little bit tonight. I wonder why." But I didn't like the way he often would be accused of something by a previous debate participant, and when given a chance to respond, he wouldn't address the issue that had been raised. He would raise a critical comment about the other person. And the low point was when he went after Pete Buttigieg, because Buttigieg has some wealthy donors. And I think it's unfair, because you have two real billionaires on the stage, Steyer and Bloomberg, and to pretend that Pete Buttigieg is captive to the wealthy because he has 40 or 50 contributors who happen to be billionaires. The most they gave was $2,800. And I just think that that is it's a point that Sanders has used before. And I thought it was a weak response. And often Bernie came across as being evasive. For example, when asked how he's going to pay for Medicare for all, free college tuition, and many of the other programs that he champions, he did make a kind of a weak effort to talk about his plans to pay for Medicare for all. But he had just released a document. He didn't refer to that. He didn't tell people to go to his website and get all the details. And so he came out, I think, looking evasive and avoiding answering the question. Now, at one point, when Biden tweaked him about his votes in the past about gun regulation and immunity for gun manufacturers, Biden hit him pretty hard, noted that the Charleston church shooting had occurred within walking distance, and while he said Bernie wasn't responsible for those 9 deaths, that the waiting period that was in a bill that Bernie voted against might have prevented that shooter from getting his weapon. And so Sanders said that while Joe has voted for terrible trade agreements and the war in Iraq, he said, "I have cast thousands of votes, including bad votes." That was a bad vote. And so I think that that was a good response. He showed humility. He showed a willingness to admit that he has been wrong. And I think that goes a long way to neutralizing the attacks on Bernie's past votes related to gun regulation. And so overall, we'll get to some of the analysts and the pundits' comments. I thought Amy Klobuchar tried hard, but I don't think she really connected. She came across as the kind of kind of a scold and saying, "Gee, Bernie, you can't get people excited about these things that you can't deliver on." And Elizabeth Warren, as I said, used a Me Too approach. But one of the comments that I was surprised by is she did a good job of saying back in 2008, after the meltdown, I went to work to build the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And she suggested that Bernie did nothing. Quote, I did the work and then Bernie's team trashed me for it. Now, I don't know what she's referring to there. I only know that my view is that her effort to portray herself as a victim of Bernie Sanders doesn't work. Now, Pete Buttigieg was extremely aggressive with Sanders, did a lot of interrupting, talked past his time limit repeatedly. And I do give Pete credit. He holds his own. Here's this guy, he's 38 years old, he's been a mayor, and he's up on the stage with, top senators and people who've been around for a long time. And he was unbowed. He didn't seem the least bit intimidated. But it led him to many lines of attack that I think raised more questions about him than what he said. As if he is superior to all of these other people. He is the cool one who doesn't engage in arguments about the 1950s and the Cold War and the 1960s and the Revolution. But some of those comments show his age and inexperience and a kind of condescension. That somehow, while he's the youngest, he is the adult in the room who will, in his view, unite America around a modest and moderate agenda. So Sanders, as I expected, did get hit after the trap that was laid by Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes broadcast on Sunday night, the question about Cuba. And then Bernie had praised the Castro government's emphasis on literacy and education. Now, Sanders was prepared for this one. He said occasionally it might be a good idea to be honest about American foreign policy, and that includes the fact that America has overthrown governments all over the world, Chile, Guatemala, Iran. And when dictatorships, whether it is the Chinese, that's a reference to Bloomberg's softness on Xi Jinping, or the Cubans, when they do something good, you acknowledge that. But you don't have to trade love letters with them. And so one of Pete's lines of attack related to that was, this is not about what coups were happening in the 70s or 80s. This is about 2020. We're not going to survive or succeed. We're certainly not going to win by reliving the Cold War. And we're not going to win these critical House and Senate races if people in those races have to explain why the nominee of the Democratic Party is telling people to look at the bright side of the Castro regime. Now, here Sanders, I think, did score by not litigating what Buttigieg had said, and he said, let us be clear. Do we think health care for all, Pete, is some kind of radical communist idea? Well, Marco Rubio thinks Sanders is a communist and is using the Cuba gotcha question. He tweeted yesterday, Bernie Sanders is actually not a socialist. His sympathies and ideas are Marxist. Then he told Sean Hannity, this is Marxism based on the belief that no person has any value as an individual, that your value is that you're a member of a class. Now, I think that falls flat because anybody who buys into Bernie's message knows that that is bullshit. Washington Post columnist Dan Baltz is quoted here. The tone of the debate ultimately became a metaphor for the Democratic race itself, marred repeatedly by candidates interrupting one another, talking over each other, and constantly ignoring the moderators' efforts to bring some order to an unruly evening. He goes on to say, what the evening highlighted was the degree to which Sanders stands apart from the field, with the other candidates divided and sparring with one another as much as with him. Sanders has his base, and it has served him well enough so far. The others are trying to find theirs. None of Sanders' rivals rose significantly above the others. For Sanders, that was probably a satisfactory outcome. Now, I do agree. Because of the scrum, and because Tom Steyer was attacking and being attacked, and Biden was taking a lot of blows, Buttigieg and Klobuchar were fighting, and Warren was slashing. Depending on who your favorite is, you probably came away unchanged by this debate. The New York Times published a lengthy piece which has brief comments from their opinion writers on the performance in the debate last night, and they flatly declared Sanders the winner, Buttigieg second, and Warren third. Here's some comments about Sanders. Gil Duran. In a game of pin the tail on the socialists, Sanders took some hits, but it won't affect his base. Too agitated at some points, but that's his brand. He got everyone arguing over who is more progressive. Elizabeth Brunig. Bernie is the front runner, and he certainly got the treatment, with Biden, Bloomberg, Buttigieg each spending a significant amount of time scrutinizing his record. He defended himself ably, had a few good laugh lines, and handled a hostile crowd well. Speaking of that hostile crowd, Bernie made a point in the post-debate comments that a ticket to that debate last night cost over $1,700. I mean, those are Super Bowl rates. And as a result, the crowd was pretty conservative and did put up some boos for Bernie at a couple of points over the course of the evening. Hector Tobar says Sanders stood in the center of the storm, held his ground. For the most part, he left the impression of a credible nominee. Mimi Swartz, he was like Rambo, ready for every attack and ambush. No teacher will earn less than $60,000. Marijuana legalized. Free public university. But still hasn't explained how we're going to pay for all this. Michelle Goldberg. She's the one who wrote yesterday, to my surprise, that Bernie can win. Regarding the debate, despite some boos, he rarely seemed thrown by his competitors' attacks. While he's right about America's ugly history in Iran, Chile, and Guatemala, and while I agree that Netanyahu is a reactionary racist, he left me as frightened as ever about how his unapologetic leftism will play in a general election. Jamel Bouie, for the first 45 minutes, he took attack after attack from his competitors, brushed them away. That gives him the win. Gail Collins, no relation to me. Nobody knocked him down. Will Wilkinson, I think this is fair. He took palpable hits in the early going on the impracticality and exorbitance of his vision, as well as his tendency to see the silver lining in authoritarian socialism. Well, I don't agree with that. He got atypically defensive and turned the bellowing to 11. For the most part, the field unaccountably let the front runner skate, but it was still his worst debate. And I do think it was a poor performance by Bernie Sanders. Now on to Elizabeth Warren. She finally took shots at Sanders as a vague idealist who can't get things done. She left a mark, but kicking Bloomberg in the teeth is her love language. She was strong on the filibuster. She wants to eliminate it. In education, but didn't register the overawing triumph of the last debate. Let's see who else commented here. Gil Duran. Strong performance by Warren, but at this point it's not clear what her lane is besides kneecapping Bloomberg in order to benefit her chief progressive rival, Bernie Sanders. Michelle Cottle, who I've identified as a member of the editorial page team at the New York Times, who is very clearly anti-Bernie, she said it was not a pretty scene. Anyone tuning in hoping to gain clarity about the field was instead treated to a 2-hour collective panic attack. As a result, it's unlikely much damage was done to any particular candidate, unlike the entire field, which wound up looking frantic and fractured. And then later she writes, after strong showings in the first 3 states, Sanders has emerged as the presumptive front runner. This is a delight for the passionate plurality of Democrats who see him as the inspirational revolutionary who will save this nation. And then she expresses her own view for the rest of the party, many of whom fear that Sanders is so far outside the mainstream that he would damage down-ballot candidates in the general elections. This development is unsettling, if not outright terrifying. As I mentioned yesterday, this is the kind of commentary that will be used by the Republicans, the way Willie Horton, who was first used against Mike Dukakis by Al Gore. Well, that was a real power blow to Dukakis back in 1988. An interesting sidebar from our friends at the Gray Zone Project, noting that the red baiting of Bernie Sanders was conducted on 60 Minutes by Anderson Cooper, who also works at CNN as an anchor. Well, the reporters here note that Anderson Cooper has admitted that when he was a college student at Yale, He spent 2 summers working at Langley at CIA headquarters. Now, that is not damning in and of itself, but when you see the way he used a CIA talking point to damage Sanders and how it has resonated for days, I think it's worth noting. Now, the other high point of Bernie Sanders' debate argument last night was when he was challenged about his announcement that he's not going to appear at AIPAC this year. The Zionist conference begins Sunday, and he said that he would not be there because its leaders welcome bigots. In his tweet, he said, "The Israeli people have the right to live in peace and security, so do the Palestinian people. I remain concerned about the platform AIPAC provides for leaders who express bigotry and oppose basic Palestinian rights. For that reason, I will not attend their conference." Now, this has been denounced as truly shameful by AIPAC and its allies, but in the debate, Sanders stated, "I'm very proud of being Jewish." Then he called Netanyahu a reactionary racist. Quote, "I happen to believe that what our foreign policy in the Mideast should be is absolutely protecting the independence and security of Israel. But you cannot ignore the suffering of the Palestinian people. And given the politics of our moment and the rightward pro-Israel tilt of the Democratic Party, I think that was a courageous and balanced answer." Mike Bloomberg did better in this second debate than he did last week in Las Vegas. But one notable moment was after he had been challenged by Elizabeth Warren for providing millions of dollars in campaign support for Lindsey Graham and for the Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey. She also completed that litany by saying back in 2012 he dumped millions of dollars into Massachusetts to support, she didn't name Scott Brown, but the Republican incumbent. And she said, "Fortunately, I beat him." But she clearly defined Bloomberg as a Republican running in the Democratic presidential primary. And in a tepid response, Bloomberg bungled it. He tried to say, look, the majority that put Pelosi in power, the 2018 people, there were 41 elected, 21 of them, he almost said bought. But he corrected himself and said got them or got them in. It was a very weak statement, but it did betray his sensibility that he owns the politicians he contributes to. And I've been pointing out that I'm so disappointed there are many worthy African-American leaders in this country who've taken Mike Bloomberg's money, and now they are supporting his candidacy. Let's look at the fact-checking. Regarding Elizabeth Warren's attack on Bloomberg that he told a pregnant employee she should kill it, well, the background for that is that the Washington Post recently quoted a former Bloomberg employee who said he witnessed the conversation and that it was outrageous. Now, Bloomberg has denied he ever said it. He left a message for that employee who complained saying that I didn't say it, but if I did, I didn't mean it. So that one's not going away. So Tom Steyer attacked former VP Biden for his role in legislation that led to high rates of incarceration among Black and Latino people. And the fact-checkers say it was mostly true. Steyer said, "You wrote the crime bill to put hundreds of thousands of young Black and Latino men in prison." And I'm surprised that really this is the first major time that that issue has been brought up. Then the issue is, did Sanders mischaracterize studies of the cost of his health care plan? And the this is New York Times fact-checkers, they poke a hole in his claim. He said what every study out there says Medicare for all will save money. They cite studies that don't show a savings of money, but they don't cite what studies are, what those studies are. So I don't accept their claim at this point. Sanders was asked how he could convince voters that the economy would do better under Trump, and he talked about, he said the economy's doing great for people like Bloomberg and other billionaires. In the last 3 years, billionaires have seen an $850 billion increase in their wealth. For the ordinary American, things are not so good, and they say that both of those claims are true. And the critical thing about Mike Bloomberg was that he took credit for New York State's legalization of same-sex marriage. Quote, "I got the Republican State Senate to vote for gay marriage virtually before anybody else in the country." And that is not true. It started here in San Francisco. And he's talking about 2011. California had legalized same-sex marriage long before that. So that one doesn't resonate, as Bush might have said once upon a time. And then related to the gotcha question about Cuba, Sanders' response was that Obama had said many of the same things about Cuba. And Biden's claim that Sanders did not condemn the Cuban government and that Obama didn't support authoritarian governments is rated false, and I agree with that assessment. So as we see today, James Clyburn, the highest-ranking African-American in Congress, he's from South Carolina, and he dramatically endorsed Joe Biden today. We all knew it was coming, and I do believe that this is Biden's race to lose. The polls show him slightly ahead. He used to have a huge lead there. He does have a history of strong support from African Americans, and his alliance with Obama seems to support that. But according to the omniscient voice of the Times, the most likely scenario remains Sanders amassing a delegate lead, especially if he pulls off a surprise win in South Carolina. So it is in flux and remains to be seen this Saturday what the turnout will be and what the ultimate choices of South Carolina voters will be. This surprised me a little bit. Nancy Pelosi, quoted today as saying that she is comfortable with Bernie Sanders at the top of the Democratic ticket and does not believe his presidential candidacy would jeopardize her majority. Now, Pete Buttigieg said that at least 3 times last night, and I believe Amy Klobuchar chimed in. And it's anybody's guess. The House is not a solid lock for the Democrats. And as I've said repeatedly, a tweet storm from Trump in the month before the election could have devastating impact on Nancy's speakership based on a conservative majority. And here's a sellout. Tom Malinowski of New Jersey. He used to be with Human Rights Watch. Then Obama gave him a State Department job. Then he won a seat in 2018 in a purple district. And now he says selecting Sanders would fritter away the chance to wrest the presidency from Trump. Why would we risk this extraordinary opportunity by nominating somebody who has a tendency to divide our own side is beyond me. Well, that is political posturing, and frankly, it's bullshit. Now, Frank Bruni came away from the debate saying that the proceedings scared the hell out of me. Quote, "That's only partly because I fear they're right about Sanders." And he says, "If I were Trump, I'd edit it into a campaign commercial and blanket the airwaves with the headline, 'Even Democrats don't trust Bernie Sanders. Why should you?'" He said this felt different. It felt worse. It felt like a genuine freakout. And this is where the Democrats are a shambles. It's why I'm not a Democrat. I left the party during the Clinton era, Bill Clinton, because of its drift to the center, its embrace of corporate sponsors and donors, its shift away from the interests of working people to the technical class here in Silicon Valley. And there is an issue here. I mentioned it yesterday, that the Democrats are providing fodder. Many of them know that they've already lost, but they're taking these Hail Mary shots at Bernie Sanders, hoping to keep their campaigns desperately alive. And the damage they're doing could rebound badly between now and November. Couple of interesting op-eds today. I want to recommend Robert Reich in the Washington Post. He was Bill Clinton's labor secretary, now teaches public policy at UC Berkeley. His headline reads, "Calm down, establishment Democrats. Bernie Sanders might be the safest choice." Subhead, "Moderate candidates won't be electable if they can't speak to middle and working class frustrations." And Reich tells how for his upcoming book, he spent a couple of years visiting those battleground states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Missouri, and North Carolina. And he said that the people who were so angry at employers, government, Wall Street, they mentioned two people who might change things. One was Trump, and the other was Sanders. And so Reich says, hey, look, this guy is reading the electorate. It's not a matter of right and left. It is a matter of establishment and anti-establishment. And he closes by saying, instead of hand-wringing about Sanders' electability, maybe establishment Democrats should worry that a moderate might be nominated instead and lose. Also, I want to recommend Stephen Zunis' piece. It's at truthout.org today. Zunis is a professor of politics at the University of San Francisco. I've known him for more than 15 years. He recounts how he served as a campaign volunteer for George McGovern 48 years ago. And despite the fact that he's currently supporting Elizabeth Warren in the primary, he comes to the defense of Bernie Sanders, saying that there is no justification for the comparison between Sanders and McGovern. And I'll leave it to you to read the piece at your convenience, but he makes a number of strong arguments. And he says that these unelectability claims have generally come from conservative, anti-Trump pundits and those in the Democratic Party establishment who simply do not want to see a left-leaning president. Indeed, similar arguments were being made against Elizabeth Warren when she was surging in the polls last fall. So I think it's worthy of your time to investigate these articles. I also want to recommend a revealing piece over at whowhatwhy.org today, written by editor-in-chief Russ Baker and Matt Harvey. The article is called Mayor Pete and the Spies Who Love Him. And what we learn is that the mentor of Pete Buttigieg is a guy named Doug Wilson, an Arizona Democrat who got promoted during the Bill Clinton administration. And he's a powerful Washington and Pentagon insider who started mentoring Buttigieg right out of college. That Mayor Pete's outsider image is carefully constructed by spin masters, and it obscures deep establishment roots. That Doug Wilson encouraged once peacenik Buttigieg to join the military because back in his college days, Pete Buttigieg spoke publicly in opposition to the invasion of Iraq. And that Buttigieg claims to be running to upend the foreign policy establishment, but his 450-member foreign policy apparatus is led by pillars of the status quo. It's an important piece, and if you're a Buttigieg supporter or you know someone who is, make sure they see it, okay? Now to the coverage of the early hearings related to extradition of Julian Assange to face charges under the U.S. Espionage Act here in America. And there's great coverage at Consortium News today. Joe Laria highlights the proceedings, that the back and forth over the allegation that Julian Assange helped Chelsea Manning crack a password to steal government documents, when in fact the only known intervention was when Assange helped Manning bypass firewalls so she could download video games, which were verboten for troops who were on duty in Iraq, which is where she was. Also, the defense debunking the claim that WikiLeaks had issued a most wanted list of stories that they wanted leaked, and that this was allegedly a way to solicit stories from Manning, and the false claim that Assange endangered the lives of U.S. informants. So the proceedings continue. There's a very biased judge who has made it difficult for the Assange lawyers. And the case will continue for the next few days, and then there will be, I think, full hearings that start in mid-May. And you can go to Consortium News for live tweeting that includes Kevin Gosztola. Gosztola didn't post a piece when I checked earlier today over at his site, Shadowproof. But a lot of the argument is whether the attempt to extradite Assange is political in nature. And that appears to violate a treaty, the extradition treaty with the United States. But the judge in the case apparently is selectively reading the law. We'll get to that in a second when we look at Craig Murray's comments. But The Guardian, which I have pointed out, is not an unbiased observer in the Assange case. They note that Julian has demanded to be removed from a dock that is in the rear of the courtroom surrounded by bulletproof glass and sit with his lawyers. He complained that he can participate in the proceedings just as much as he could if he was watching Wimbledon. But the judge in the case claims that she has no jurisdiction over his treatment. He was apparently handcuffed 11 times, moved to 5 different cells the other day after he left the courtroom, and then they would not let him keep his documents. So there are many injustices that are being visited on Assange on a daily basis. Now to Craig Murray's comments from the public gallery. And I'm just going to read a couple of quick highlights, but he is a great writer who describes the scene, I think, very well. And if you have time, follow the link in the show file to this podcast to Craig Murray's commentary. But the judge in this case is named Baratzer. And Murray knows that the mistreatment of Julian is something that she could involve herself in and get the prison officials to change their treatment. Now, first, she denied any knowledge of the practice of prison officials listening to a barrister, a judge in this case. She stated that Assange's lawyer should present her with written arguments and that if this is such a serious case, the only remedy is the defense should bring a motion to dismiss the charges on those grounds. And I think that that is a tease on the part of the judge. So then Murray goes into the issues related to Assange and his interactions with Chelsea Manning, whom he didn't know, couldn't identify at the time. They were both working behind obscured interfaces, if you will. So here's the real important one from Craig Murray. After a brief break, Baratzer came back with a real zinger. She told Assange's lawyers that he had presented findings of the U.S. court-martial of Chelsea Manning as fact. But she didn't agree that her court had to treat evidence at a U.S. court-martial, even agreed to or uncontested evidence or prosecution evidence, as fact. The lawyer replied that agreed evidence or prosecution evidence at the U.S. court-martial clearly was agreed to by the U.S. government as fact. Oh, and there's one more insult that comes at the very end. To wrap up proceedings, Baratzer dropped a massive bombshell. She stated that although Article 4.1 of the U.S.-UK extradition treaty forbade political extraditions, that was only in the treaty. That exemption does not appear in the UK Extradition Act. So she's playing games about what the controlling law is and seems prepared to come up with a predetermined outcome of this extradition hearing. James O'Keefe has notched another victim. He is the Republican operative who runs Project Veritas. He has ambushed a number of people, pro-abortion activists, a former Senator, Mary Landrieu from Louisiana. Well, his latest victim is David Wright, one of the long-running correspondents at ABC News, and in hidden camera footage apparently shot during the run-up to the New Hampshire primary. Wright is caught on tape saying, speaking of ABC, "I don't think we're terribly interested in voters. Commercial imperative is incompatible with news. Regarding Trump, we don't hold him to account. We also don't give him credit for things that he does." And then, what may have prompted ABC to suspend him? was his complaint about the insertion of Disney propaganda on ABC News programs. Like now, you can't watch Good Morning America without there being a Disney princess or a Marvel Avenger appearing. It's all self-promotional. And even more damaging, when asked if he considers himself a democratic socialist, Wright replies, "More than that, I consider myself a socialist." A truly stinky decision from the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday, setting a precedent that essentially a U.S. Border Patrol officer can shoot people in Mexico across the border, through Trump's fence even, with impunity. Going back to 2010, 15-year-old Sergio Hernandez was playing a game with his friends just across the border in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And a U.S. Border Patrol officer, Jesus Mesa, shot him in the face, killing him instantly. Mesa was on the American side of the border. He claimed the teenage boy had attacked him, pelting him with rocks. And he feared for his life. Video footage contradicted his account. Mesa had caught one of Hernandez's friends and, while apprehending him, shot Hernandez twice as he ran away. Well, yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled that the deceased child's family cannot sue the U.S. for damages, effectively setting a precedent that American officials can kill with impunity. The court's right-wing majority ruled that Mesa had indeed acted in self-defense when he fired through the border. The decision was split 5-4, and you won't have any trouble guessing who voted which way. Trump is going to hold a news conference. It's coming up shortly after I complete my podcast. If he has anything interesting to say about the coronavirus outbreaks around the world, I'll report it to you tomorrow. But he is a con man who will give us a sales pitch, and I don't expect anything meaningful to come out of it. And yesterday I reported how his visit to India sparked sectarian violence between Hindu and Muslim citizens. And you probably know there's a whole issue that the Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Narendra Modi has championed a new law that basically sets a second caste, using Indian historic terms, for Muslims. They don't enjoy full citizenship. Well, yesterday we reported that 11 people, including one police officer, had died in these religious skirmishes. That number today is up to 27. Trump's always number one. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube, and I remain Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to